This is Doug Brunke at our global headquarters in Scottsdale, Arizona. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. We have a really interesting conversation today. We like to do cross-cultural conversations because all of us doing international business experience this with almost everyone we meet, right? That when they're from a different culture, they're reacting to us in different ways than we're used to. And so today we're doing an event with 3 experts. We had 4, so I don't think she's going to be calling in today, so we'll be at 3. And they're really outstanding people with lots of experience in Europe. So we're going to be taking a little bit of a focus in on Europe today. Our first speaker is Cyle Adair. He's the director at InWhatLanguage. He's calling in from Salt Lake City. They do business all over the world. They do translation, interpretation. They have a tremendous technology. Really impressed by InWhatLanguage, Cyle, and thank you so much today for talking about digital. You're going to be talking about communicating effectively in the European markets, and I know you've got a lot of experience there. Thank you for sharing today.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. Great to see everybody, meet everybody today. Just a little bit of background. InWhatLanguage is a translation technology company, as you mentioned, and years ago when I joined, it was a very exciting opportunity and still is, particularly because the topic that I'm speaking on is exactly what brought me to InWhatLanguage. Communicating effectively, I've seen where it has helped organizations, helped countries, helped people drastically when you do it effectively. On the other side, I've seen the dramatic cases where it can definitely hurt an organization or hurt the situation drastically as well too. A little background on myself: I've lived in Scotland when I was little, Japan, Argentina, and then also myself with the military. I spent 2 years over in Iraq too, so I don't know if you can quite call it living. But again, particularly on the military side, been able to see drastically how negatively or positively effective communication can happen. What I want to take my time to kind of address and talk on is exactly what our organization does, is what we call translation. But there's 3 different things I'd like to touch on. The first is translation, second is localization, and then third is transcreation. All 3 of these can be very important as you're trying to target or try to broaden into new markets. And obviously in the European market, there's such a dense population speaking so many different languages across the board. And so a lot of questions that come to us is, hey, I want to move into the European market. What's the best way to do that? How can I effectively do that to help scale our services or our products? A lot of it has to do on the legwork of figuring out where is your target audience and what's going on. Particularly once you find out who your target audience is. Usually you can find that out through a country which can generalize what language you're looking for. Obviously, French in France. But one of the things that comes about is if you look for translation, which means a literal kind of word-for-word representation of the same words or sentences that you're doing, sometimes it might not reach very well. For example, if you look at French, it is spoken in Africa, many places of Africa. It is spoken in Canada, which it's widely used in the Quebec area. And then obviously you have France and the outer areas of France and into other countries that they speak French as well. If for some reason someone translated your content and they happen to be Canadian, they happen to be up in Canada and they translated your content, it's going to come across very differently. Just as the same way you can tell pretty quickly if someone is from the UK and they've written their things earlier in the United States. But on French, it's even a more drastic level. And so it's very important that when you look at translation, a lot of times you actually want to localize, meaning that it is someone that is from that area that is able to specifically speak that language very, very well. The way that the sentence structure is set up, certain words that are used, those are very important to localizing the content. So make sure it resounds with the target audience that's reading that content. If it doesn't, sometimes it just gets looked past. Then they go, maybe that doesn't apply here. If they get the hint that, oh, this is kind of Canadian French, then maybe this doesn't apply as well here in French. And particularly for that culture, French is actually one of those ones that not to say the word stuck up, but a lot of times they have their particular differences. And sometimes if you're in French, or if you're in France, you don't want to hear anybody from Quebec because you think they'd speak the other language, the dirty language, the French that's over there that's not even French. It's something different. And so it's very important a lot of times that you localize once you find your target audience. And this can be vice versa. Obviously, if you're trying to target Canada or the Canadian French, and for some reason you have someone translate it or localize it into European French, there'll be mixed messages, and sometimes it won't resound with that target audience and the services won't be there. On the other side, there's something else called transcreation. This is taking it a step farther. This is something a lot of times when marketing departments or when you're trying to specifically have a web page that really, really resounds, sometimes localization isn't enough, meaning that you're just having someone in that target area to translate into that. You want to truly transcreate it, which a lot of times it's taking out maybe exactly what it says in English and truly trying to recreate it and make it more beautiful, more smooth, more flowy in that language. That can be very hard at sometimes. There has to be certain guidelines given to a translator or someone that you're going to have translate or localize into that language, certain guidelines. If not, they can get off the beaten path and start maybe going in a direction that you don't want, especially if you don't speak that language. So it's very important as you're looking at translation, localization, and transcreation, figuring out what you want. Obviously, transcreation is probably going to be your best bet to make sure it really resounds, but it's going to be more costly to do that. Same thing with localization. It's a little bit more costly to do that, and translation is your cheapest. You want to look at those three different things, okay, when you're figuring out how am I going to communicate effectively to help scale my products, my services, to help the organization grow overall. I think I'll wrap up with that. We want to make sure we have plenty of time for Q&A. So Doug, I'll pass the time back over to you and look forward to your questions.
Very, very good. Thank you, Kyle. Just a quick question before we move on to the next speaker. Could you talk a little bit about what InWhatLanguage does then within that context of those three areas? When somebody comes to you, what is it that they actually receive, and how does it help their business?
Perfect, yeah. So InWhatLanguage, as I mentioned, is a translation and technology company. We have thousands of translators throughout the globe, many that we've been working with for many, many years. We have an extreme vetting process. The majority of the translation that we do is human translation. Although we do have machine translation capabilities, for the most part, that only fits in a very, very small segment because machine translation, the quality isn't quite there. And a lot of times the communication can be very poor because yeah, maybe over a whole page they can kind of get the gist of what you're talking about, but it might not be very effective and they might not fully understand it. So we have our platform, which is called Unify, our proprietary translation management software to help manage all your projects, see real-time status, see cost, see budgets. You can actually watch the translators translate as they're doing that. You can leverage glossaries and style guides. All certain things in there, particularly what we help organizations do as they're onboarding, as they're creating that, to provide documentation to help create a style guide that really helps to define, should we be doing translation, localization, or should we be doing transcreation? That style guide is really, really important to help the translator, but also help give the proper direction that organizations want.
Fantastic. Thanks. Great introduction. Our next speaker is Florian Auckenthaler. Florian is one of those global people that's traveling quite often. He's largely based in Austria, but today he's in Charleston, South Carolina. He's the founder of Designing IT. Today he's going to be talking about digital channels and website marketing. Florian, thank you so much for sharing your expertise today.
All right, yeah, thanks, Doug. Yeah, I'm in Charleston today. So Designing It has two locations. One is in Charleston, South Carolina, and then the other one is in Austria and Central Europe. And just a few brief words, like we basically build multilingual websites, multi-regional websites, and global communication strategies for clients. And the topic today is digital channels and website marketing in Europe. And if you want to go to that first slide for me, sorry, yeah. So when we build, at the core of our service, we build websites, but when we we build websites, we have to go through a process, and that process always starts for us with what we call more strategic marketing. So there's a lot of items that we need to go through before we even start any kind of design process or development process for a website. So that being said, I want to briefly talk about just a few important pieces in strategic marketing. Then number two will be how culture kind of plays into this, and then lastly, actually, we'll talk briefly about how that relates to a website and a digital channel, perhaps. So, starting with strategic marketing, that's actually a very big topic, and it goes through things like figuring out who you are as a company, your voice, your positioning, your branding, figuring out your competition, the industry, giving a deep dive into your audience, your personas, messaging. There's a lot of different pieces in strategic marketing. Not enough time in my 10 minutes here to go deep into this. But I want to tease out just a few important items that I think are the most important things for us when we go through our process. The first one is what I call need-based segmentation. And that simply means figuring out, so market segmentation, but more on a look at what needs and pain points does a group have, and how can I group these people into a segment, right? Versus like your more traditional psychographic, demographic, firmographic type personas. I like to look at need-based segmentation. And this goes into the second step, which is deeply understand your audience and what they're looking for. These two items are always, if I cannot ask a client anything else, I will at least try to say who is your audience, what are their needs, and then how can we communicate your services to them. Like these are like the core items of any kind of communication. So the third one here is communicating your message that resonates with your audience. And for communication, I think the first two steps need to be fairly solid. Need to be clear on who that audience is and what their needs are before you can even figure out how to devise messaging for them. So a couple of key points around this that I see sometimes. Don't try to do everything, right? It's better sometimes to focus in on a clear niche and be a strong player in there, as opposed to like trying to do everything all at once. And the second very important item that I always bring up is don't talk that much about your product, right? Talk about how you can solve your client's issue. So not so much me focused, more customer focused is what we prefer to do. In B2B, what that means to me is figuring out a competitive advantage to your customer, and so rather than just trying to help them avoid a disadvantage, help your customers come up with a clear competitive advantage, right? That's sort of the difference between a commodity and a highly valuable service to me, right? Creating something for your customers that really gives them a competitive edge, a financial competitive edge, if you will. So there's much more to it in strategic marketing, but the key items for me are segmentation, understanding your audience, formulating messaging around this that speaks about how to solve their pain points rather than what are my product features. Now, when we want to switch to the next point here, which is culture and multicultural marketing, the way this relates for me is that can we switch to that next slide there, Cesar, please? Yeah. What's interesting about the need-based segmentation for me sometimes is that in certain cases, these segments can transcend culture, right? It's you could have the same exact need from a customer sitting in Germany as the customer has in China or in the US. And so that's an interesting aspect to me for needs-based segmentation, because it can transcend borders like this. And especially when it comes to Europe, it's such a, the previous speaker already mentioned, such a homogeneous market, not a homogeneous market that has so many different languages and countries in one place. So that can sometimes be nice to have, find the similarities that are across different cultures and languages. All right, so yeah, let's still stick with the culture here before the. These are just a couple definitions here. For me, the most basic definition of culture, it's communication. Right? So, I mean, culture is not just language, but if it boils down to it, for me, it's like culture is communication. And a little bit of a more longer formal definition here is that culture is a way of life of a group of people, and the behaviors, beliefs, values, symbols, traditions that they accept without even thinking about it, right? It's a very deep-rooted system, is culture. And what multicultural marketing does, it's the awareness of these different languages, ethnic groups, traditions, symbols that might exist when you segment out your market into different cultures, and also subcultures. So need-based segmentation might transcend a border, but communication does not, right? So we need to understand language and culture and these kind of things if we want to communicate with that audience. Everybody prefers to be talked to in their own language, so that's an important piece to understand. And this also ties somewhat into the channels, because every culture, every group, every subgroup has their own communication style and preference. And what that means is they use different channels and different ways of communication. And for multicultural marketing, that means you need to research and figure out where are these channels, what are these people's preferences, and how can I get in front of them. So that ties into that next slide here, which is the channel and the website. The way I see it is with a website is, for us, that's usually more not just a channel. The website is a little bit bigger. It's your central hub, your central system. It's a core piece in your strategic marketing, your communication. And a few tactical things here maybe for building either a multilingual or multi-regional website. The first thing to consider for this is, are you language targeting your website, or are you country targeting your website? And that's particularly important in Europe, because there's so many languages and countries in one place. What this means is, am I making just a German-speaking section of my website, which could, in theory, speak to Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Northern Italy, and so forth? Or am I really localizing in and making a country-specific website for the Swiss market, for the German market, for the Austrian market? That's the high-level strategic thing I need to figure out, because it has so many implications, technically, implementation considerations, and so forth. The next step is around domain structure. So if I'm country targeting, most likely I might also have a country-specific domain name, like .de for Germany, .at for Austria, IT for Italy, and so forth. Or maybe if I'm language targeting, I might go with more of a subfolder structure, which is usually you have a generic domain like a .com, and then at the end you're adding your underscore en for English, underscore de for German, and so forth. Both of these also relates into your SEO, into your website marketing, and there is implications, benefits and disadvantages for both. So that strategic decision of where to go with this becomes important for this. Make it easy for your audience to find a potential language switcher, potential switchers. Do not use flags for languages. That's not a good indicator for language switching. It's okay to use flags for country, but just don't use it for languages. I recommend the top right on your website to position your switcher. And I also recommend, usually from a visual perspective, maybe a globe icon or some sort of visual indicator of where that switcher might be located. Lastly, make sure you translate this switcher also into the local language. Else, like if you go to a Chinese website and the language switcher is in Chinese, you still won't find it, right? You either need a visual cue or they need to actually give you this in English so you can switch it over. Just a couple of technical items around a multilingual website. As far as the channel strategy goes, really it goes back to segmenting your market, understanding communication preferences, and figuring out where these people hang out, and then you can devise and test these channels. The big three for us are still great in the US and in Europe, really. Google, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn are huge in Europe and in the US. So you can use these three in a lot of markets. There's some nuances, of course. Germany has half LinkedIn, half Xing. So it's, you might change channels depending on where people communicate. So that's basically it for, like I said, very high level. In summary, I would say need-based segmentation, understand the needs of your audience, understand cultural nuances when you do localize there, understand things that are the same, even across cultures. I think that's very important. Figure out what is not different, right? Where can we deploy the same sort of campaigns perhaps? And then create a website that kind of follows an international strategy of either language or country targeting, and then making it user-friendly for your people to switch over if they need to for languages. And that basically concludes my 3 points here today.
Thank you, Florian. Appreciate that. We have some questions, and for those of you watching, there's a Q&A section down below. Please send your questions in there, and we'll be happy to process them. And so thanks for those who have already sent. The last speaker today is Janet Gruenenfelder, and Janet has got a really interesting background because she's lived both in the U.S. and in Europe quite a while, in Switzerland, and she's the founder of her own consulting firm. Today she's going to be speaking about the cultural experience on working in Europe, and she's also going to touch on both legal and immigration issues. So Janet, you're zooming in today from Dallas. Thank you for your contributions in advance. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Doug. Okay, like Doug mentioned, I'm a global business specialist with experience in working globally. In areas of the industry, I worked for many years for a company, an American company actually, that imported products from the United States, and we disseminated those products into Europe, Middle East, and Africa. Later on, I moved to some other positions, and I concentrated more on people management, that is enabling project consultants to work globally around the world. So I have worked in 3 different types of areas. I've worked in the areas of industry, financial services, and consulting over the last 25 years. I lived and worked in Europe most of my life, more specifically, like Doug said, in Switzerland, and I'm a dual citizen of the USA and Switzerland. Most recently, I've worked in helping companies develop or determine the immigration and taxation aspects of working abroad as salespeople or as consultants. And when working globally, it is really important to know the implications of traveling to a country and working in a country for longer periods of time. There's an immigration and a tax aspect which some people are aware of it, not all people, but it can become a risk for you if you are working longer term in a country. So I'm going to touch on that aspect, but what I wanted to do briefly is go back to the culture aspects, back to what Florian and Cyle also mentioned in their talks. I had the opportunity to work in a business environment in a U.S. entity and non-U.S. entities, and I saw how these different nationalities functioned, and understanding others is such a key point. Their personality is a big part of the equation to working successfully, and I found that even though there are these indicators from like ITIM International, or I think it's called now Hofstede Insights, to show you how the cultures differ. Within those cultures, the people, the individuals are going to be different too. So no one fits into a perfect mold of the culture aspects of a country. And I think both Cyle and Florian hit on that really well. I can cite a couple of examples. When I was working in the US entity, and we were working in the European headquarters and bringing products into Europe. So we had salespeople, marketing people. We brought in expats from the US to work with us. Some of them were successful and some of them weren't. And I think a lot of it had to do with the communication. And at one point, I remember one of my bosses, he was Swiss, he said, gosh, this new guy who's come here, he's supposed to be an international trade specialist. What is he doing? He said, I think he's a spy. So I was kind of tickled at that remark because I knew the American fairly well. And, you know, in fact, we were almost neighbors. But it was just that fact that they didn't understand. And the American, he was fairly quiet. He wasn't very open, probably not communicating enough. And there was this aura of distrust of what he was doing, and people felt insecure. So it's really important that you have this avenue of communication. And I think Cyle mentioned that really well when he talked about the language barriers. You know, I lived in the German-speaking part of Switzerland, but we speak Swiss German, which is a dialect. It's not true German. So when we bring Germans in, to us, it's almost like a foreign language. And you have to understand those people, where they're coming from, because those Swiss, for them, speaking in High German could be an issue. They're not all that well versed in High German. So the culture and the way you communicate is very important. And I know not everybody is going to be able to learn a specific language, but understanding where they're coming from is key to having a successful cooperation. Another instance I had was I worked with a Swiss woman. We were in the same department, and we worked on a lot of projects with, in fact, we implemented a software, a US-based software into our program. And as we were implementing this software, I realized that she was not happy. And as time went on, I could tell it was because it was American. And she had some distinct issues with certain people that we discussed on rollouts, and she goes, oh, I just don't like this approach, and what is she saying? And it was difficult because you can see their dilemma. And oftentimes when we would have people come to the office, the first thing she would tell them, she said, well, do you speak German? And of course, you know, these people didn't speak German, but it was her way of saying, I am accommodating you. This is my territory. And it was very interesting. It's quite an experience to see and to see how these people react and how they deal with the situation. So communication is key. And when I look back at my career there and the companies that I worked for, the people that succeeded the most were down to earth, humble, not boastful people that knew their place and were interested in the country they were visiting and in the people and how things were run. That is very key. And oftentimes there may be cultures as the US culture or the German culture is that you go in and you're going to say, oh, I'm going to do it like this and this is the way we should do it. You have to be careful how you approach it. So those were my tips about the culture. I mean, I could go on, I'd have lots of examples to share with this, but just to go on to the immigration and tax aspects, I don't know how much time I have, but yeah, 1 minute. So what I want to say is when you are going into a new market and you're traveling a lot to Europe, an American national that has a U.S. passport, you have to have a U.S. passport. They have visa-free entry into most countries in Europe. So you have no problems to get in, but you should be careful when you're working there longer term. In Switzerland, for example, you're allowed to go 8 days in a calendar year on a business trip, marketing, or let's say a conference, a workshop. If you go there to work, you need a work permit. And if you have sold someone something, you've sold them a software, you want to help them build up their website or whatever it is, you should be very careful going into that country. If you're staying there for a longer period of time, you would need to probably register in that country. And if you would say go over a period of time, you reached a 90-day limit in that country for a calendar year, you have become taxable. So you need to address the issues. How am I going to manage that immigration and that tax risk when I go to another country? And that, I can give you some examples on that, but I can wait until the Q&A to see if anyone has a specific question about that. So thank you. And back to Doug.
Great, thank you, Janet. And I think you said something there that explains the whole world in one sentence, and that was the example you chose around the woman who didn't understand the man or woman who didn't understand the guy, and so he obviously was a spy, right? So that concept of I don't understand that person for whatever reason, they're doing something different than what I'm used to, and so they're not one of us. There must be a spy. They're not just one of them, but they actually might be coming after me, in a negative way. And so I think a lot of what we see on the news, it feels like that concept, right? Not really understanding people as well as they should. So thank you very much for some really good examples there. And the last part where you talked about being humble, not boastful, and sharing an interest in whoever you're working with. Those are all really good words to live by, and certainly Globies, whether you're working in your own country, and especially important when you're working in other countries. There are a number of questions, and so let me open the floor up to these, and please jump in. The first question relates to something that at least maybe all three of you spoke about, and that is on specific industries. I'm a chemical engineer, for instance, originally, and if I don't know enough chemical engineering anymore to do it, but if someone's talking about chemical engineering in English, I can pretty much tell whether they know what they're talking about or not just by the words that they use. And so that's kind of technical. Most people wouldn't be able to do that. So when you're talking about specific industries, whether it's designing a website or whether it's in your communication about what the product is, what additional steps need to be taken? Because that's more, Cyle, than just a translation, localization, maybe more on the transcreation. You're actually now speaking a language that's specific to an industry or a profession. How do you take control of that situation?
Yeah, you really do need a person with that expertise. Good example, I don't know anything about chemical engineering. Even on the English side, like you said, you could be able to pick up really quickly and go, this guy has no clue what he's talking about. It's very easy on the translation side as well, because maybe they look up in a dictionary and then use a term and it might be using incorrectly. One of the big things, at least on the translation side, that we look at, we go through, there's several different there's certifications, and then also there's testing that we specifically do with our translators to find out what areas are they strong in. You can have people that are strong in medical or legal, engineering. You're going to have, and we have about 20 different tests, 20 different industry kind of tests that you take, education and many, many more. And so it's important on the translation side that we're picking and using the right person that has the qualifications to do that. And two, it's being upfront and honest. If for some reason it's a very, very, very small niche market, being an honest and upfront and saying, hey, there's nobody there, so either we can kind of look around a little bit more, or is it worth it to do the best that we can with this and move forward? It just depends on the person that's making that decision to do that. Maybe time isn't of the essence. So yeah, if we need to wait 3 more months and find the right person and do that, we could do that. Or on the other side, maybe it's, look, the market is hot. We got to move into it now. Let's do the best that we can right now.
Gotcha. Great. Florian, I presume in your case, you end up doing the best that you can, your team does, and then part of it is then checked by the client, right, in terms of making sure that the flow and the specific words work in a particular industry?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, for a website, you might be talking about 8 to 10 key landing pages that are used there on the web. So not talking about news item and blog items, but just the main structure. And for this main structure, you would work with both the client and then with professionals like Cyle, like translation agencies that would help with this and provide this content for us, right? So the content creation for us is usually, at least when it pertains to the key pieces of a web page, that usually gets provided by the client, or we work hand in hand with a translation agency that helps exactly with this point. It becomes a little bit more interesting for content strategy, blogging, and so forth, right? It's that definitely, and there's so many considerations for that, and it's not so easy to do a global or multi-country content strategy. There's a lot of considerations around this. And a client needs to be ready for this. They have to be of a certain size and have a certain internal resource to even be able to do something like this, because it is quite time intensive to do it right. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. And if any of you, I miss you in terms of providing an answer, please, just insert your answer in at some point along the way. Another question, since several of you, all of you have U.S., Europe experience, could you talk a little bit about maybe specific differences that you see between how Americans and Europeans approach things? And one, I'm actually Polish German, but second generation American. And one thing I noticed with Germans is and maybe Europeans in general, their humor is more sarcastic or a little bit more twisted and more complex than Americans. And so, it takes me a little bit of time to adjust to that humor. There's many other elements. What other things and what do you see between the two and that would help Europeans in the U.S. and Americans in Europe?
I'll chime in a little bit on that. Culturally speaking, there can be, word differences and things like that. I think a lot of times most people, when they think of Europe or when they think outside the United States, they go, man, there's so many holidays that they're on. They're always on holiday. Anytime I email them, I get a out of office, they're on holiday, they'll try to respond. I think a lot of people can look at that and go, man, they're not really hard workers. Extremely hard workers. They're great. That's one thing that I appreciate. They're usually very efficient in what they do, because they know, hey, I want to be on holiday. I want to be on vacation with my family, or whatever they have planned during those holiday breaks. So I think, in a sense, European markets in general, looking at this, they move a little bit more strategically and a little bit more precisely. And they know, because they can't make up in planning where it's a 24-hour, hey, they're always awake and always open. In the U.S., and I'm part of that. The mindset is, I work, and yeah, I still answer emails on the weekend. I'm on vacation. I was off on Monday. I was still answering emails on Monday. We just kind of, in the United States, have kind of adopted that because we're up 24/7 moving all the time. European markets, not quite as much that. They really hold that time as sacred with their family or sacred with, hey, I'm on vacation. We don't do that as much here in the United States. So just something to kind of think about that they're not quick to always go, hey, I need an answer immediately. I need this. I feel like they're a little bit more patient overall, sometimes comparably to the United States or the American markets.
Yeah, if I may add a couple of things here too, Doug. Europe is not, you can't just say Europe, right? So you'd have to go almost country by country. And like Janet was saying before, even if you take a country or a subculture in a country, there's individual, right? Everybody's shaped individually by their experience, background. So it's very difficult to just make a blanket statement on this stuff. Academically, there's a few frameworks that exist that sort of try to explain this stuff, like Hofstede, Trompenaar. There's like 4 or 5 academically accepted frameworks that try to sort of put this against like different dimensions, like how individual are people, group thinking, what's their socioeconomically, how do the hierarchies and all, they try to identify like this. There's a couple, actually, if I may inject, there's 2 blog posts on my website. One is actually exactly this. It's called Understanding Culture in Order to Build a Successful Digital Marketing Strategy. And it sort of goes through like 4 or 5 of the more popular frameworks like this. And there's a second blog post that we have that speaks specifically about the difference of marketing in the US versus the difference of marketing in Germany. And yeah, there's lots of differences, right? So just to name some examples here, if we take Germany, US here as an example, for marketing and for brand messaging in Germany, it's much more product and features and benefits focused, more neutral. In the US, it might be a little bit more of a lighthearted tone and a little bit less on the features, more on maybe the benefits. Addressing a client in Germany would be much more formal. In Germany, it's a little bit more friendly, speaking more chatty in the US maybe. Imagery also a little bit different maybe, very crisp and clean in Germany, more tech focused, more specs and catalogs and things like this, where it's more playful in the US maybe. These are just a couple of samples there, but there's definitely a lot more, and that's just Germany, US. So if you want to go country by country, there's definitely more differences.
Okay. And just to reiterate what you said in there, you mentioned, I think his name is Hofstede. Yeah. The person that I actually changed my whole perspective about culture was Fons Trompenaars, who you mentioned. He wrote a book. I read it in 1995. I vividly remember it, called Riding the Waves of Culture, and it talks about how those different elements of culture matter. And so if you really want to deep dive into this topic, there are real experts. I think they're almost all Dutch for some reason. I have no idea why.
I think Hofstede Insights, I think they're from Finland, right?
Oh, are they? Okay. Oh, maybe you're right. That's. I think you're right.
That's true. There is a lot of Dutch. Yeah.
Exactly. So, Janet, how about you? What do you have any perspectives on the kind of the U.S., Swiss, certainly German-speaking area of Switzerland? You have a lot of experience, so you've had to kind of adjust in both areas and be accepted in both areas.
Yes. Well, yeah, that's also a question of integration. I mean, if you live in country for a long time, hopefully you will integrate, but there are people that live in a country for a really long time and they don't. But I think one of the greatest compliments that I ever received was from a work colleague of mine. We shared an office, and she told me one day, she said, "You're just like one of us." I never considered me or them. I thought we were just all in one group. But yeah, you have to realize that these people think differently and they're looking at you from a different perspective. And going back to that situation I mentioned before about one work colleague of mine who definitely had an issue in this rollout of a software as a service, we had to change our our representative, the one who was going with us day by day in the setup of this software. This person just didn't like her. She said, "Oh, she's really chatty," and look, she goes, you know, just the way she reacted, the way she talked, and it just didn't go over. It really didn't go over. I mean, I realized it, but unfortunately, the person in the U.S. didn't. She needs to read the book.
Yeah, I think some people have a hard time adjusting for sure. This actually relates to a question from Mike Jameson. I think this is the Mike Jameson from Wisdom Natural Brand. So Mike, thank you for watching today. Is there a resource list or table for travel and travel issues by country? Is there a kind of like a place you can go to learn?
Oh, okay. Well, I can tell you what we used. Working in, I worked for a period of time in one of the big four, and these departments there, they like, for example, the tax department, they have on the website, they have these huge guides which give you information about the legal and tax aspects of about any country in the world. I think Ernst & Young has one, PwC has one, KPMG probably has one. So if you go online, I think you can even view that without a subscription. You can buy them. You can buy the books.
Okay.
They're very good.
Very good. I know the U.S., if you're an American, the U.S. State Department, I don't know what restrictions it has for foreigners. I think it looks to be open, but you can actually go on the State Department website, and they have every country in the world there, I believe, and it talks at different levels of, you know, adjusting. It has economic data and other things, but there is cultural information as well. And so, so besides what Janet mentioned, the U.S. State Department, and then the books that we talked about earlier are deeper dives into specific cultural things. And what the examples on the cultural side would be something like how close do you follow the law versus your family? And there's actually, I think, a word for that. So the Swiss are very much leaning toward following the law versus your family. So if you find out your brother had a tax problem, the Swiss person would more likely report the brother than a Malaysian person. Not that it's unethical, it's not really an ethical question, it's more of a cultural question. A Malaysian, because there's a family connection, would more likely not report your brother to the tax authorities because the family connection is a little bit stronger. So there's levels of cultural, besides translation and localization, there's levels of cultural issues that are explored in those books. Anything else, Cyle or Florian, on that topic? And if not, we have another question. So this is, I can't see the name of the person, but this is for you, Janet. She's a U.S. citizen, usually a resident. In the past, lived in Schengen country. Is that Switzerland? During a 90-day period doing translations for clients back in the U.S. or third countries, but not local clients. Was that illegal? Would it make a difference if the work was billed through a U.S. entity? So that's a kind of a little bit of a...
She was present and doing the work in Switzerland?
Right, but her clients were in another country, so she was being billed...
Yeah. Okay. Did she have a work permit in that country?
Doesn't say, probably not.
Okay. So to do it correctly, to work in that country, to work in a country, you need to have the work permits to work there.
Okay.
So that maybe was not 100% legal, but chances are you won't get caught. I have done work here in the U.S. for Swiss startups, and I have, well, I'm a dual national, so I can work in any location, and I do not have to have a work permit. But that's something that you need to consider, where you're providing the service and where you are sitting when you provide that service.
Okay, no, that makes sense. I think this is a question, although it looks like more of a comment, and maybe you could talk to this. In addition to a friend, and sorry, I don't see your name. This might be Terry, TNL. I'm assuming that might be you, Terry. In addition to French translation localization, for instance, Paris and Montreal, particular difficulty of the French language is the use of accents. And I know, since I know a little bit of Japanese, and as I traveled around Japan, northern Japan, Akita Prefecture has Akita Ben, Akita slang or Akita accent associated with it. So how does that get incorporated into, probably not so much the website, but maybe more kind of in the spoken word that gets translated? And maybe it's also something that you as a worker in a different area, you're learning a language from that area probably typically, but then when someone comes in, like if you're an American and someone really speaks Cajun English, it's hard to understand, right? So it's something similar to that in many parts of the world, right? In Europe, there's a lot of that goes on.
And in some parts, I'll kind of speak to this. In some parts, yeah, slang is more of the general tone for maybe that region or that part of the country. For example, I live down in Argentina. We speak, technically you can say Castilian Spanish, but it's really what they call Castellano. And so there's a lot of slang that's built into kind of culturally of what they're saying and what they do. They call that lunfardos, that slang. Specifically in the verbal things, those things are going to have to come up if you're going to speak truly on their language. That's a great example of also what transcreation is. We work with a company called Burton Snowboards. If you guys, do any skiing or snowboarding, you've probably heard of them before. Burton is very unique in their marketing that they say, hey, we're the first ones to thrash the slopes. We're making everything sick out here. Well, if you translate that, that's going to come out very, very odd. If you localize it, that still might come out a little bit odd. Transcreation is really what has to be leveraged and used in that aspect, because being sick, being ill is not exactly what you want to be able to say. What you really want to say is, hey, this is cool. And you're going to have to change to whatever the saying is for that area. And that, in a sense, can be like what Doug mentioned, can be different in northern Japan, sometimes compared to southern Japan. It can be very different, particularly, that Quebec French or that Montreal French and the European French. So those will change, and that really a lot has to do with that transcreation. How much do you want to get into that slang and that lingo? You might want to, or you might want to say, no, we want to stay away from that. We want more of a professional. I imagine, Janet, with your experience working with the Big Four, they probably want it more on a professional level rather than using the slang terms.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and yet that can be very endearing, right? Like if you're, and I'm thinking about the German-speaking of Switzerland, area of Switzerland, there's some tension, I don't know if that's the right word, between the High German and what German is spoken there. And so if you understand that, you can diffuse and maybe acclimate to Switzerland by not making fun of it, but understanding it, and which I think again goes back to Janet, a point around being humble, not boastful, and being interested. If you're understanding things like that at that level, people everywhere around the world love that, right? That you've taken the step of understanding and trying to really work hard to understand who they are and the nuances of who they are. I'm sure, Janet, that you've had plenty of experiences.
That's a big part of being accepted, is that you're interested in the culture and the way they do things. And it is an important part that it will improve your acceptance within the community and the people you work with.
And I would say kind of overall, most cultures, and again, this is just a blanket broad statement, but they appreciate when you're trying to learn and you're trying to apply. Most people appreciate that. Yeah, you could probably get made fun of. I've been to places where people make fun of it, but the far majority, from my experience, they appreciate that, and they appreciate you trying, even though maybe it's not very good communication, but they know that your heart is in the right place.
Right, exactly.
Gotcha. In the remaining time, could you maybe share some other ideas or tips on, endearing yourself or becoming acclimated in the new culture? Florian, I can't imagine a more dramatic difference between Austria and South Carolina. They're very different cultures. Do you have a switch in your head, to make sure that you're in the right place at the right time and saying the right things? How would you handle that situation?
Yeah, I've been back and forth for 15 years, so I'm quite used to switching. I raise the kids bilingual, so I switch all day, right? It's like it's very automatic for me, like this. But yeah, when it comes to business, it's there's definitely a huge difference, and knowing culture and communication style between these countries goes a long way. And it's just everything you do in business, whether it's giving feedback to an employee. You wouldn't believe how different that is in Germany as opposed to in the US or other cultures, right? And if you don't notice as a manager and you provide feedback in the way you're used to, this will be very, very challenging for your employee to understand. So the classic example is German companies sends their people in the US and the US manager here, right? This classic example. They need to learn these nuances of culture and communication to make this successful.
Yeah, I might add here that I just moved back to the States about 2 years ago, and I've gone into the reverse culture shock, trying to adjust and understand the American way of doing things, and a lot of things I don't like, and which I think are better in Switzerland. Or you tend to compare things and say, oh, well, yeah, this is not good. And my daughter even told me once, she says, you have to stop thinking so much about Switzerland. It's difficult if you have lived somewhere for a really long time and you're making a change, a drastic change like that.
Well, my last kind of 2 cents on that, I think, is a good example. I mentioned that I lived over in Iraq for a couple of years, 2 different deployments when I was with the military. One of the things that I felt drastically helped out a lot of times the success of our mission, or getting the right intel, is building, obviously, relationships. I think in business you want to do that. Obviously on your personal life you want to do that as well too. There's 2 things that will never leave my mind, because it's the same questions that I asked majority of the time as I met with different leaders, Mukhtars or religious leaders or government leaders or Iraqi military and things like that. The very first thing is you say assalamu alaikum, so that's hello, and then also at the same time, or actually it's translated a little bit differently, but in English we'll just say hello. Shlonik means how are you doing, and Shlonik Jahal is how is your family. And so you open those very 2 things up. If you do that, I've seen a lot of success, because they know your intent is you're speaking, or at least you're trying to speak their language. I'm sure my accent is way off, but I'm trying to speak their language, and I'm concerned about them and their family. Those are the very first things. Not sure they'd respond back and tell me, and sometimes I got the use of knowing, hey, things are going well, or sometimes they go into great detail and I didn't know exactly what they're talking about, but thankfully I had an interpreter by my side. But I think the intent that that you're trying to be endearing, you're trying to speak their language, and you're caring about probably what most likely were the most 2 important things for them, and that's them and their family.
Gotcha. So, we're going to wrap up now because we're at the end of our hour, but I first want to thank the 3 of you. Really great insights. Those of you who are watching, if you have additional questions, send them in to info@globalchamber.org and we'll handle them. We'll likely get this up in a blog post in a week or 10 days or so, and so you'll have another chance of getting your questions answered. I think I'll harken back to something that Janet mentioned, and that was, going back to your country is an adjustment. And I've had the good fortune to have 2 expatriate assignments and have training on the front end of both of them at American University in the U.S. And both times it was very clear, and both times we saw this, is that they told us your children will have more difficulty coming back than going. And that goes to what Janet's point is, and I think those of us that are Globies understand that. We thrive in these kinds of cultures in different areas around the world, but then when we come back to our own culture, we can sometimes be looked at as an outsider, or we own our own self, or our view of our own culture changes and adjusts, and we have to readjust back into our culture, for better or for worse. In my case, I became a stronger American, I think, because of my experience living overseas, but I also fell in love with Japan and Singapore, were the 2 places that I went. And I also recognize that there's an awful lot of really amazing people and places around the world. And I think that's one thing that those of you who are watching and those of you who are members of Global Chamber understand. You're part of the global tribe, and the world is an amazing place. And fortunately, you're knowledgeable enough and sensitive enough, and as Janet talked about, humble enough, not boastful enough, and interested enough to be successful. Thank you, for gentlemen and lady, for your knowledge today, and thank you all for listening. Have a great day.